absurd promise not to raise tax on working people, whatever they are, has boxed her into this corner where she now has to do a sort of essentially a fiscal sleight of hand.
At the moment, there is a lot of conversation about raising taxes, about spending, and really all of this is the same conversation we've had for really the last 20 years.
And I completely agree with Lawrence. It's bizarre to, on one hand, say like a reformed policy is bad because it applies to existing migrants, people who might be here already. But our policy is fine because it will apply to just a different cohort of people who might come here more frequently. It makes no sense at all.
From CapEx, this is The Capitalist. I'm Marc Sidwell, and my guests today are Alys Denby, Opinion and Features Editor at City AM, and Lawrence Newport, co-founder of the Looking for Growth campaign. It's clear that Rachel Reeves has no easy options. At Labour's conference, the Chancellor promised to keep taxes, inflation and interest rates in check, but she also signalled that November's budget, as most of us already know, may well bring fresh increases in taxes, citing global turbulence and lingering economic scars. Yet Britain cannot simply tax its way back to growth. The question now is which levers Reeves will pull, and whether Labour can balance short-term revenue with the longer horizon of prosperity. Alys, are we just stuck in a tax doom loop in Britain now? Is this all we can expect, more and more tax rises?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels that way. I think this is a consequence of political decisions that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer made ahead of the election. This absurd promise not to raise tax on working people, whatever they are, has boxed her into this corner where she now has to do a sort of essentially a fiscal sleight of hand. So what everyone, I think, is expecting, what the city is budgeting for, is a further freeze in thresholds, which, of course, massively increases fiscal drag. It pulls many more people into higher tax bands. It's very distorting and damaging for the economy. One thing that she's also rumoured to be considered doing is perhaps broadening the VAT base, which is something I think we could be slightly more supportive of in a sense, because VAT is one of the less distorting taxes, because being a consumption tax, people are free to avoid it if they so choose. Interesting, though, that Wes Streeting has been very quick to dismiss the idea that we might have VAT on private healthcare. He clearly recognises that private provision takes pressure off the public service and is a good thing, which we should be welcoming. So good to hear from that. But look, the real problem that Labour has isn't just their bad political decisions on the economy, it's also their complete inability to cut state spending. They tried to do very modest changes to the welfare bill. It wasn't even cutting welfare, it was cutting the rate at which it's increasing, and instead somehow ended up spending more money, because despite having this huge majority, Keir Starmer cannot get anything past his extremely left-wing backbenchers. And if they can't reduce state spending, then of course all they can do is continue to borrow, continue to tax.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, there are rumours already about them being under pressure to take away the two-child benefit cap, which is just going to increase the need for spending rather than going in the other direction. I mean, Lawrence, one of the other possibilities for Labour, as well as cutting spending, which they don't seem able to do, would be some real pro-growth regulatory reform. Do you think they've got chances of getting some of that through as well, so that might make a difference in the fiscal picture?
I think they have a chance of getting it through. I think they probably have about 12 months, maybe very generously 18 months to really make a noticeable difference. This is because obviously politically, once you've kind of spent your first 2 years, 2.5 years, you're looking even more at the next election, and your decision making becomes quite different. Whether or not it should do is a different matter, but just politically it does. They do have an opportunity. They are talking about a second planning bill in a kind of admission somewhat that the first one was nowhere near radical enough and they won't see the benefits of it anyway. The reality is, at the moment there is a lot of conversation about raising taxes, about spending, and really all of this is the same conversation we've had for really the last 20 years. And I don't know about anybody else, but I'm extremely tired of it. The actual route out of this is to allow companies to start. It's allow people to try new ideas. It's to allow people to actually form companies here, to travel, to bring ideas, to not leave, which is what we are seeing, to travel to places like San Fran, get ideas, to go to New York, to go to other places across the world, to hear of ideas, bring that back, to trade and otherwise. But it is not to simply continuously raise taxes, which is our current approach, and indeed for governments to unambitiously tinker with the edges, as you talked about before, or as the previous Conservative parties did, to simply not do anything about the foundational problems in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alys, one of the things we haven't talked about yet, but is very much Rachel Reeves looking at her shoulder at, is the bond markets. I mean, there is a feeling from those who we actually need to borrow money from when we don't have enough tax revenue to cover all this huge amount of spending, that they're just not convinced at the moment that Labour is able to control the public finances in a responsible way, and that spending isn't just going to get completely out of control. Do you think that's enough to provide some sort of check on her, or are we just going to end up running into some sort of bond crisis because Labour just won't be able to make the numbers add up?
I think what's quite concerning about the bond market's position of her is that when there was sort of rumours or indications that she might go, they react extremely negatively. So the bond markets clearly think that Rachel Reeves is sort of the best we've got at the moment. But they are very anxious for her to keep within her self-defined fiscal rules, which does make her life very difficult in terms of her freedom to borrow or spend, and does mean she has to rely ever more on tax increases. But yeah, look, I mean, we can't afford to borrow anymore. The idea that Andy Burnham was saying, well, we need to get out of hock to the bond markets is absolutely absurd. But it's clear that this is still a big strain of thought within the Labour base, and that's extremely concerning.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thought about Labour, that this may be the most fiscally responsible Labour government we could currently have. I mean, Lawrence, what's your thought on all this?
I was actually going to ask, when you mentioned that the bond markets don't want Rachel Reeves to leave, is this because actually what they're concerned about is actually just change? As in, it is better to stick at least a course of some type. When, of course, over the past several years, we've had so much chopping and changing at the top of government that it is extremely difficult to predict what's going to happen from one moment to the next.
Yeah, Alys, do go ahead.
I think it's a bit of both. I think that there is I suppose this is Rachel Reeves' self-defined securonomics premium. But I think it's also that they fear something much worse. I think there's political risk is factored in there as well.
Interesting. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, let's move on to our next topic, another political hot potato. Labour has announced that migrants will need to prove that they are net contributors, speak good English, and have no criminal record to qualify for permanent residency under new government plans. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood will also require volunteering and national insurance contributions, though existing settled residents are exempt. But will these measures be enough to blunt Reform UK's rise? Lawrence, what do you think? I mean, this is an interesting policy from Labour, coming just after they've really criticised Reform quite heavily for their own thoughts on reforming ILR.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure the politics of this really messaging on the one hand about very strong criticism of reform, and then trying to get somewhat close to their policies on this. It is just to speak politically, it is a very odd choice in those terms, in terms of messaging and otherwise. I think if Labour wants to actually respond to the widespread concerns about immigration, I think it currently ranks as the number one concern for people over the age of 35. Under 35, it's the economy. For people over 35, it's immigration and then the economy. I think they need to actually do something, and not just, which they keep doing at the moment, which is making announcements. This is something where they do actually need to get away from simply saying things, similar as we've seen with a lot of their planning moves, to announce things and then not actually do something. That's going to make the difference to voters.
Yeah. Alys, do you think this cuts through at all with the public, or will they simply prefer Nigel Farage? If they're interested in these issues, will they just simply prefer Nigel Farage's much larger sort of bid in this political area?
I think what cuts through with the public is that Keir Starmer called reform racist. I think what will cut through is people will think, okay, so if I'm concerned about illegal immigration, if I'm appalled by this spectacle of people coming here in small boats, of people dying in the Channel, of people coming into these communities, committing crimes, whatever it is, working in the black economy, then I'm a racist rather than someone who has a genuine concern about a real policy problem. And I completely agree with Lawrence. It's bizarre to, on one hand, say like a reformed policy is bad because it applies to existing migrants, people who might be here already. But our policy is fine because it will apply to just a different cohort of people who might come here more illegally.
Yeah, yeah.
It makes no sense at all. And
nobody's persuaded by that.
yeah. And
Yeah.
Lawrence is completely right as well that what they've actually announced here isn't a policy; it's yet another consultation. One in, one out with France is, it's a good thing. It's part of the deal, but it's not actually reducing the overall numbers, is it? Because it's one in and one out. So yeah, it's not enough. So we need to do something much bigger. It needs to be a proper deterrent. It needs to be proper. You cannot stay here if you come here illegally, and it probably needs to involve reframing human rights legislation. Something which, incidentally, Keir Starmer is uniquely well placed as an internationally respected human rights lawyer to do. He could make the argument that our current framework is no longer fit for purpose, a more compassionate approach, but that responds to a period of mass migration, but he won't do it because that's not the kind of guy he is.
Yeah, and of course it's notable that this particular policy from Labour doesn't seem to address what for many people is the elephant in the room, which is the 1.3 million immigrants who came in the post-COVID surge, the so-called Boris wave, who will be coming up for ILR really quite soon. And they're simply saying, well, this will be, for all future migrants are going to be on this. So they seem to be missing the mark. But it's interesting because they're very much putting forward Shabana Mahmood as this new super tough figure who's going to really talk the talk on these issues in a way that the public like. But so, Lawrence, for you just don't think that this new rhetoric is really making any difference at all? It's just sort of superficial stuff from them?
I am extremely tired of rhetoric. I think that's partly the problem, is we keep hearing things. And I have been a victim of this many, many times, and I'm sure many, many people have, getting excited about something, thinking, wow, something's going to happen. And then it turns out it was something already announced a year ago and nothing happened on that. And when I check 6 months later, when it's no longer a headline from their own press release, it's then very clear that nothing's actually moved either. In fact, some of the projects that they've announced, at least handful of those aren't actually even going ahead. It's the same problem over and over and over again, which is government by announcement, then nothing seems to happen, and then the public feels more and more disillusioned correctly, and the government's response to that is, well, surely what we need is more announcements.
Yeah, I was feeling some sympathy for Kemi Badenoch because what Labour's now announcing seems quite similar in some ways to policies that she was announcing back in January about extending ILR from 5 years to 10 years and so forth. And that shows one of the binds that she's in and the Conservatives are in when it comes to announcements, because, of course, they're under a lot of criticism where people say, well, you have to come up with policies, and they're saying, well, we need to wait because we want to come up with them. If they do announce policies and they're any good, then people can just steal their thunder, and in this case, Labour can just come up with something. So I don't know. Do you think, Alys, this is sort of part of the calculation that the Tories have to make on these issues? Is that if they do start coming up with concrete policies, they're just, they're giving ammunition to other people to just steal them or undercut them in other ways?
Yeah, reform's not just stealing their policies; it's stealing their MPs too, right? Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of frustration in Conservative circles that the narrative and the kind of media coverage seems to be framing this as a fight between Labour and Reform, and that they are really struggling to get any kind of cut through. Part of that is, I think, was a deliberate choice on Kemi Badenoch's behalf. She said she wanted to go away and have a thing and not announce things. But I think that's proved a mistaken strategy when you have this, when you have the big flashy story of reform that is just, going to get more coverage. It's just more interesting, really, than a party that's just gone away and sort of turned into an internal think tank. Not there's anything wrong with think tanks. We love them. But yeah, that's just talking to itself, really.
Well, let's move on finally to quite a big announcement from Labour, but as Lawrence has been saying, the real question is whether they actually deliver. The Prime Minister has appointed Conservative peer Lord Banner to draft a bill targeting something called the Aarhus Convention. It's an international agreement that ensures those who want to challenge large infrastructure projects are able to cap their losses at minimal rates. Although it's little known, it has cost the UK millions, blocked jobs and construction, and failed to protect the environment. But will it survive Labour's army of disgruntled backbenchers? Now, Lawrence, you wrote about this for CapEx, very interesting piece, which I recommend people go and read after this. But could you just explain a little bit what the problem is with the Aarhus Convention for the UK in planning?
Yeah, it is a very odd law that essentially means that if you want, as an individual or an organization, to launch a judicial review against a large infrastructure project, your fees are capped. If you're an individual, they're capped about £5,000. If you are an organization, they're capped about £10,000. That means that if you lose, your fees are capped. So these are not cases where they've succeeded in making a good argument that this project, even with our current large amount of environmental regulations, they haven't managed to make a successful argument. They are nevertheless now uh, exempted from something like 95% of the actual cost, which means, of course, the taxpayer is paying the rest of those legal fees. So we are essentially paying ourselves to block and slow down projects to the tune of millions and millions of pounds, not just to the projects themselves, but obviously to the delays, to all the construction industry, to all of the jobs, to all of the people who would eventually work in those places that are now suffering under continuous legal delays. And this isn't a minor problem. In fact, there are individuals and organizations that essentially raise money to do this repeatedly, because they might as well. For the cost of maybe only £30,000, you can hold up with 3 different judicial reviews a project for maybe 1 or 2 years. And if your goal is to make it more difficult to build in this country in general, that's a pretty cheap price to pay.
Well, Alys, I suppose the question is, can they actually get it through? It's very exciting, perhaps, to hear talk from Labour about doing something really quite radical. You were talking about how Keir Starmer won't probably overturn human rights law to sort out problems with immigration. But here he is potentially saying that here's this international convention that he might consider pulling the UK out of. But even if he wants to, will he be able to get it through? Will the civil service block it? Will it be his backbenchers? Is it just going to get run into the sand like so many other things?
I think let's give him some credit here, because this man he's appointed, Lord Manning's, is a Conservative peer. He's a close associate of Rishi Sunak. He literally wrote the book on this Aarhus Convention. He also did a lot of work for the previous administration on nutrient neutrality. And as you said, it seems like he's recognising the problem that some of these international treaties that we've signed up to might be causing problems for us and need unpicking. So this is exactly the sort of thing that you would want a government focused on growth, to be looking at. So 10 points for that. The problem is that you are going to get all the bats, all the newts, all the green campaigners who are going to say this is going to be terrible for the environment. When you've got a big threat to Labour's left from the Green Party, it is difficult to see how they will get this through. But maybe because it was quite technical, maybe they won't notice, get it under the radar. But look, this is exactly the sort of thing we need to be looking at, right? Unpicking the things that are stopping us getting the growth we need. So let's hope he succeeds.
Yeah, Lawrence, I mean, if it goes through, are you optimistic about the difference it will make, or is it just the start of what we need to really get radical growth going?
I think it would be a meaningful step. Obviously, there is still a lot of problems with the large broad base now of judicial reviews that are possible, and what that can actually mean and how long those can take. That's not solved by this, but it certainly does reduce the number of frivolous judicial reviews that currently we are paying for, not just directly, but also indirectly from all of those lasting effects. I would also echo, it is actually very, very good that he is talking about doing something on this, even though it's still just talk. And I don't want to yet again fall into this trap that I keep falling into. But it's possible that something, if this is the kind of thing that they're first looking at, maybe it's something that they are going to build on. And then we really can start to see some major, major changes that would have dramatic effects. And of course, it is the case that they are being challenged on by the Greens and by particular members of their backbenchers as well. But the reality is they are facing electoral oblivion, and we know this can happen because it just happened to the last guys.
Yeah.
We know how badly this can go, and the only route through is to actually improve the economy. It is actually to make people feel better off and to actually address the things people really, really care about, including immigration, including crime, and so on. But actually, people consistently are telling the government, and in fact yelling about it and screaming about it, that they are worse off. That is just true. And if they are not going to come to terms with that, it won't matter about the Greens and otherwise, because they will be just torn to pieces by the electorate, who very correctly will say, we voted for you on the basis of change, and actually nothing changed.
And I would say Conservatives should support them when they're trying to do sensible things like this. When it's being led by one of their own peers, they shouldn't try to make narrow party political points or stand in the way of infrastructure in their own constituencies. They should support growth, pro-growth moves.
Or worse, like they have in the past, actually voted to keep these things when Labour's tried to change it, which did happen on the last planning. With the current planning bill, I should say, Conservatives voted alongside Green and Green Labour MPs. And it was only actually Reform and Labour who voted through some of those policies, which might actually grow the economy.
Yeah, I suppose, Alys, the more that Labour leans into these sort of abundance-themed ideas or growth-based ideas, there's a risk in a sort of polarised environment that the Conservatives start sort of feeling, oh, well, that's what the other team does. What we'd like to see, I suppose, is like Lawrence perhaps would argue for a sort of competition between the two traditional main parties to sort of increase these things and go further and be bolder. But do you think the Conservatives can do that, or is there a risk that they're just going to lean into their NIMBY-ish side, which is also something that they have quite a strong streak of?
I think that's certainly a risk. Where I think the Conservatives should be making gains electorally is by talking about reducing the size of the state. Labour and Reform have no interest in state spending at all. Conservatives do. I know they've done a lot of work on the welfare bill. You know, they had welfare cuts in their manifesto, which Labour then borrowed. So that's where I think Conservatives should be focusing. And when it comes to supply-side pro-growth measures, they should just do what's best for the country.
Yeah. Well, as we head towards the Conservative conference next week, it'll be interesting to see how the messaging is playing out there. We're going to have to leave it there for now for this week. But Alys Denby and Lawrence Newport, thank you both very much. Make sure you're subscribed to our daily email briefings. Go to capex.co. That's capx.co. I'm Marc Sidwell. Goodbye.